If you are familiar with tales of Camelot, you have probably heard of Morgan Le Fay, the sorceress from Arthurian legend who was equal parts healer, heartbreaker, and havoc wreaker. Morgan is sometimes referred to as King Arthur's sister, either half or whole, depending on the story being told. But what about the claims of Morgan being a shapeshifter who schemed, seduced, and spelled her way through Camelot, all in the name of love? The obsessive, jealous, twisted Valentine kind. Stick with me and let's find out if Morgan is a Holiday of Hearts icon or a misunderstood goddess with an axe to grind.
Immortal sunshine.
Hello and welcome to the podcast Shedding Candlelight on Cryptids, Hauntings, Mythology, and more. If it is weird, we are talking about it. This is your host, Donna, and today we are going to start at the beginning, looking into the very first mention of Morgan Le Fay. Morgan is deeply rooted in Celtic mythology, with her likeness being the same as Morrigan or Modron or Modron, goddesses connected to war, fate, and the concept of being the divine mother. Morgan first shows up in the written record as Morgan with an E in a text written by Geoffrey of Monmouth, a medieval Christian cleric, scholar, and writer who was born around 1095 in the vicinity of Monmouth Wells. Geoffrey is thought to have been of Breton descent. The Bretons were Celtic people native to the Brittany region in the northwest of France. They had fled places like Wales and settled in the Brittany region. However, later during Geoffrey's lifetime, the leaders of Monmouth were Bretons, and because of this and the fact that his writings are deemed as being sympathetic to the Bretons, scholars believe Geoffrey was of this Breton descent himself. In his early adult life, Geoffrey moved to Oxford, England, and spent most of the rest of his life in that area working as a teacher and a clergyman. He was ordained as a priest shortly before being consecrated Bishop of St. Asaph in 1152, and he died 3 years later in 1155. During his too short life, Geoffrey wrote many books, one of them being the history of the kings of Britain that he completed between 1136 and 1139. This book is claimed to be a translation of, quote, a very old book, end quote. What's fascinating about Geoffrey's history of the kings of Britain is that it was considered a factual account of history for centuries. This work details the founding of Britain by Brutus of Troy and moves then through a long succession of kings all the way to the reign of King Arthur. Geoffrey's historical account includes Merlin, Camelot, and the Sword of Caliburn, which later becomes known as Excalibur. Modern excavations have not undeniably proven that King Arthur was real, though I think there is some pretty good evidence that he was. What has been proven is that during the Dark Ages, people were not illiterate idiots. There were large, thriving towns with language, art, expansive trade networks with other parts of the world, and a great deal of wealth and innovation. And despite our modern technology having provably made us a little dumber and not smarter, we are continually finding archaeological sites that not only rewrite history, but that date humanity's very existence to earlier in our timeline. For this to be true, a couple of things happen. Some people survive cataclysmic population decimating events. These people then pass down their traditions and histories, moving old ideas and beliefs forward into new civilizations. Then conquerors come along and either appropriate the tales as their own history or they erase the history of the other people by saying it never existed to begin with, which is exactly what happened to Geoffrey's History of the Kings, even though it was claimed to be a translation of a very old book that detailed real events and was believed to be fact for centuries. Modern scholars said, nope, it's all hogwash, just a bunch of fantasy because sorcerers and magic are not real. They agree that Geoffrey took information found in other works that were written before his time, but scholars say these works were fiction and that Geoffrey coupled them with oral traditions and added his own fantastic flair to create the history of the kings. It's an arrogant position considering there are magical, fantastical, and supernatural events recorded as fact in the Bible itself. But fact, fiction, combinations of both, it really does not matter. People believe what they believe based both on what they know, what they don't know, and the folly of not knowing what they think they know. It's all about perspective. People knew the world wasn't flat before they knew that it was, and then found out again that it wasn't. Once we become dogmatic in our beliefs, we know we have reached critical levels of capture instead of critical levels of thinking. Nonetheless, Geoffrey's writings gave birth to the vast landscape of Arthurian legends that we know and love today. Morgan with an E is described in Geoffrey's Vita Merlini or Life of Merlin, a poetic type of work that was written around 1150 to expand upon the life story of Merlin the wizard. In these writings, Morgan is described as one of 9 sisters who rule over the Isle of Avalon, a place Geoffrey mentions in his History of the Kings, and simply describes it as a remote magical island. Later in Vita Merlini, Geoffrey expands the description of Avalon, first calling it by a different name, one that translates to the Isle of Apples or the Fortunate Isle. He portrays the island as a paradise, saying the land there is eternally fertile, that fruit, especially apples, grow there in abundance and that the inhabitants of the island are blessed with long lives, free of disease or the need to work the land. Sort of like the Garden of Eden. However, Geoffrey says the island is ruled over by 9 sisters who are each skilled in the healing arts. So maybe it's them who keep the inhabitants alive and well long into old age. The 9 sisters each have their own personality and purpose, but they are led by Morgan, who is described as a benevolent goddess or enchantress. In a modern translation of a passage from the Vita Merlini, Geoffrey describes the head ruler of Avalon this way. She who is first among them is more skilled in the healing art and also surpasses her sisters in beauty. Morgan is her name, and she has learned what useful properties all the herbs contain so that she can cure the body ills. She knows too the art by which to change her shape and to fly through the air like the Aegis on strange wings. When she wishes, she is now at Brest, now at Chartres, now at Pavia, and at will she glides down from the sky onto your shores. This passage claims that Morgan can shapeshift, and in later tales of Camelot, it's claimed that Morgan can fully turn into birds and other animals. However, Morgan's name translates to seaborn, so she's of the sea. Le Fay translates to the fairy. Many think these translations relate to Morgan being a fairy queen of the island in the sea, one who can visit mainland shores anytime she would like by simply spreading her wings and flying wherever she chooses. This ideology harkens back to Morgan having Celtic roots, and her identity mirrors roles of other sovereign goddesses of the ancient Celts, who were often depicted as women who guided kings and rulers, giving legitimacy to their rule and helping those kings navigate life, death, and sometimes even rebirth. In Geoffrey's first naming of Morgan, he portrays her as benevolent and without malice. She's a protector, not a villain. In Merlin's life story, Geoffrey details how Morgan saves King Arthur, taking the wounded king away after he is gravely injured in his final battle. Morgan takes the king to Avalon, where she can heal the dying king, making Morgan an ally of the king in this first naming of her, not his enemy and not his blood relative. Later in the 12th century, another book is published, this one by a French writer who claims that Morgan with an A is actually Arthur's half sister, born to his mother before she was married to Uther Pendragon, Arthur's father. In this remaking of the Fairy Queen, she is demoted to being simply a woman married off like the trading commodity she is to King Urian. Morgan then goes on to study magic under Merlin. I know you men get mad at me when I point out certain things, so I am not going to point out Morgan's power being stripped away and then only credited back to her after a man is given credit for being the one to explain magic to her. Nope, I am just skipping right over what I cannot help seeing in every single one of these old retellings. At least in these early remakings of Morgan, she was portrayed as being a generally good person and accredited with being a skilled healer, someone who made bombs and things like that for the injured knights. Then enters the drama. Morgan is accused of having an affair with one of the knights, and it is Queen Guinevere, her sister in law, who exposes that affair. From here, not only is a rivalry between the two women born, but Morgan is henceforth painted as a woman tangled up in all kinds of love affairs that are embroiled in schemes and malice. The 1400s are when Morgan's transformation from kind-hearted queen into Camelot's villainess is complete. The stories of Morgan being Arthur's sister, either half or whole, portray the siblings as starting out on good footing and with Arthur having a great deal of trust and admiration for his sister. But Morgan is painted as a full-hearted woman who falls in love at the drop of a hat, that hat-dropping love causing her to be simple-minded enough to not only turn on her brother, but against the whole of Camelot. In many of the stories, Morgan is portrayed as Merlin's opposite, where Merlin is good and fights for righteousness. Morgan is cruel and shallow, only caring about herself and her latest fancy. Merlin gives good advice and Morgan gives self-serving advice. Merlin is wise and Morgan is nothing but a tempting beauty. Because even Geoffrey, in his first naming of Morgan, said the Fairy Queen was quite stunning. But Morgan was not as pretty as the wholesome do-gooder Guinevere that King Arthur just had to marry. After Guinevere tells on Morgan for having an affair, Morgan decides to get even in a few different ways. I will give you a conglomerate of some of the more notable deeds attributed to her in these Arthurian stories. Morgan steals Excalibur's magical scabbard because it has the power of healing and keeps Arthur from dying in battle. Morgan takes the scabbard and gives it to her lover and then enchants a boat, having the boat take Arthur out to where he ends up having to duel with Morgan's lover. But even without the healing power of his scabbard, Arthur wins the duel. Morgan is beside herself with grief after her lover dies and vows to get revenge one way or another. starting with that lousy husband she was forced to marry. Morgan tries to stab him while he's sleeping, but her son intervenes and stops Morgan from killing his dad. In epic fashion, Morgan claims that it wasn't her who was trying to kill her husband, the king. She was under a spell, bewitched, taken over by the temptation of a fiend. For King Arthur, Morgan has a peace offering, an apology for having tried to kill him with the whole lover duel situation. She's just a lovesick dope, and she's relieved that her brother wasn't killed. So Morgan sends Arthur a stunning cloak made of the finest materials, a bejeweled garment fit for a king. Only the Lady of the Lake gets involved, and instead of Arthur trying on the cloak, he has the messenger Morgan sent with the gift to try it on for him. The maiden does, and she instantly ignites in a burst of flames, which upsets Morgan even more because not only did she fail to trick her brother into his own death for the second time, but Morgan sent one of her favorite maidens to deliver the cloak. So now she's really ticked off because Arthur has taken her lover and one of her favorite maidens. But when it comes to love, Morgan has her eye on a new man, the one and only Sir Lancelot, a knight of Arthur's Round Table. The problem is that Lancelot has eyes for Guinevere, the queen who is married to Lancelot's boss, King Arthur. Not to worry, though, Morgan has a plan to save her brother from the embarrassment of being cheated on and to save herself from rejection. Morgan drugs Lancelot and traps him in what translates to the Valley of No Return, a magical place where Lancelot is ultimately supposed to forget that he loves Guinevere and instead become loyal to Morgan. But Lancelot was a top knight for a reason. He is able to resist the magic and essentially begins dying of heartbreak. Morgan decides to free him because she loves him. She doesn't want to see Lancelot die. So she lets him go and then exposes the affair between Lancelot and Guinevere, sparking the downfall of Camelot by pitting the head knight and her brother, the king, against one another. And that is how a woman scorned brings down an empire. It's almost as if the writers should have left her alone, let Morgan be a fairy queen who wasn't bothering anyone. But alas, we do like drama. Yet, in the bitter end of Morgan's transformation from good to bad, she is still the one to save King Arthur. When he is mortally wounded, Morgan is always there, scooping up her brother and taking him to Avalon so he can heal and possibly live out a supernaturally long life where maybe, just maybe, he is still alive, awaiting the day he might return from the Isle of Apples. The later stories are not quite a redemption arc for Morgan, but that's only because those are made up. But what about Geoffrey's version of Morgan? For the sake of time, we are not going to deep dive into the entities that predate yet resemble Geoffrey's description of Morgan. We will just assume, for the sake of argument, that those entities are the legends that impacted Geoffrey's writing, either because he believed they were real and compiled them into one likeness, because he thought one of them was real and named her Morgan, or because he did not believe himself, but needed such a character to round out his stories. Since Geoffrey's account of the kings was believed to be fact for centuries, do you think that would more point to Morgan or something in her likeness being real? The supernatural elements of Jeffrey's story are not disqualifiers because, in some form or another, we all have beliefs tied to supernatural elements. Therefore, we are not allowed to say that our magic sunglasses were real, but Jeffrey's were fake. So, unpack your belief structure and ask yourself if the stories being told are regurgitated true events from civilizations that came before us, certainly mixed with some embellishments. Or do you think all of Jeffrey's writings were pure fiction intended for amusement purposes only? Kind of like the one well known fiction writer who got into some occult type stuff and started a religion based on aliens in part that a bunch of Hollywood elites subscribe to today. It happens 1,000 years from now. Some of my own fiction writing might be unearthed and thought to be true ideology from our time, which is a scary thought. But if you have not read any of the Arthurian legends, then you should check those out. I will have links to translations of some of the old text in the show notes. And then, of course, there are lots of modern renditions and stories. I'd like to incorporate Morgan into one of my own stories, but as the original Morgan with an E. If you want to check out any of my books that are sadly currently devoid of Morgan, check out my website at leedawnabooks.com. I have a new release coming next month in March of 2026. It is the third book of a fantasy trilogy. And I do have a reading list on my website where you can see if a collection is a true series where you will need to read the books in order, or if they are standalones within a collection that can be read in any order. So please do check out that reading list. As always, I appreciate you buying directly from me. It is the best way to support my small business, but my books are also available at retailers and libraries worldwide, so you can buy and read them any way you like. If you have questions or comments, feel free to post those wherever and in any way you like as well. But if you are looking for a response from me, have show ideas or stories of your own that you would like to share with me, please drop me an email at leedawnabooks@gmail.com. Love is grand when it is pure and kind, but as a fiction writer, it is better when it burns. So here is to us keeping it burning only on the pages, but soft, tenderhearted, and beautiful in real life. Thank you for being here today. There is love all around us, even in the sun shining down on our faces. So go outside, connect with nature, feel all of the feels, and have yourselves a wonderful Valentine's Day this year. And I will see you later. Bye.
Sunshine.